6 months ago, a woman drove through my gate like she owned it. By spring, she wanted my entire ranch gone. The whole subdivision cheered her on at every meeting. I stayed quiet, took notes, and kept my receipts. Then a permit clerk mentioned something that changed everything. Her own signature didn't match the one from 1962. Suddenly she stopped smiling at the mailbox. What happened next tore Prairie View Estates apart. My name is Colt Bennett, and I run cattle on 400 acres my grandfather cleared by hand outside Comfort, Texas. My wife Dana teaches 3rd grade in town, and our daughter Ruthie feeds the chickens before the school bus comes. We built a quiet life on land that was never for sale. 3 years ago, a developer carved a subdivision called Prairie View Estates out of the old Hollis pasture next door. 200 houses went up fast, with a clubhouse, a fake lake, and an HOA that acted like it ran the whole county, not just its own cul-de-sacs. First, Prairie View kept to itself, and I kept to myself. 200 yards of Caliche Road between us like a polite fence. Neighbors waved from their trucks. Nobody mentioned my land at the community meetings. That changed the week Deborah Ashcroft became HOA president. Deborah moved fast once she had the gavel. She repainted the clubhouse, banned basketball hoops in driveways, and fined a widow for leaving her trash bin out an hour too long. People said she ran the board like a courtroom where she was judge, jury, and the only lawyer allowed to speak. Her husband Richard sold real estate 2 counties over and drove a truck too clean for actual work. Around the subdivision, people whispered he wanted Prairie View to expand, though nobody could say exactly where the land for that expansion would come from. I didn't think much of it then. The first sign of trouble was small. A silver SUV cut across the north corner of my hay field one Tuesday morning. Tires chewing a track through grass I'd been growing for winter feed. I figured it was a lost tourist. I fixed the fence and forgot about it by supper. 2 days later, it happened again. Same SUV. Same corner. This time trailing a second truck loaded with landscaping mulch. I flagged the driver down. He said his HOA president told him this was the fastest way to the new phase of construction. He seemed more confused than defiant. I drove to the clubhouse that evening to sort it out politely, the way you settle things with neighbors. Deborah met me at the door with a clipboard already in hand, like she'd been expecting me. She smiled the way people smile right before they hand you bad news wrapped in manners. There's an access easement through your northeast corner, she said, tapping a laminated map. It's on record with the county. I asked to see the deed. She said her attorney was handling paperwork and I'd get a copy soon. I left with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite name yet. My own deed, the one my grandfather filed in 1962, showed no easement anywhere near that corner. I called the county clerk's office the next morning. The woman on the phone said no such easement existed in their system. Only a note that someone had requested old plat records the month before. I mentioned that to Dana over dinner, and she went quiet the way she does when she's already 3 steps ahead of me. Someone requested the records before they told you about the easement, she said. That's not confusion, Colt. That's homework. I didn't want to believe her yet. The following week, 3 more vehicles crossed my field, ruts deepening into a real road. A contractor's flatbed left tire marks so deep I had to reseed the whole corner. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The deputy who came out took photos, shrugged, and said it looked like a civil matter. I started keeping a folder. Every date, every vehicle, every photo of the ruts, every voicemail from the county clerk. My father used to say paperwork was boring until the day it saved your life. I didn't know yet how right he'd turn out to be about that corner of grass. At the next HOA meeting, which I wasn't a member of but attended as a concerned neighbor, Deborah stood at the podium and announced Prairie View was working cooperatively with the adjacent landowner on a road realignment. 200 heads turned to look at me like I'd already agreed to something. I stood up and said plainly that I hadn't agreed to anything, that no easement existed on my deed, and that the driving needed to stop immediately. A few neighbors nodded. Most looked at Deborah, waiting for her cue. She just smiled and said we'd work out the details privately. Walking to my truck afterward, an older man named Frank Delgado caught up with me. He lived on the edge of Prairie View, one of the few original ranch families who'd sold off a smaller parcel before the boom. "Watch her," he said quietly. "She doesn't lose." I asked Frank what he meant. He just shook his head and said he'd tell me more when he had proof instead of suspicion. I didn't press him. My own fence to mend, and a growing feeling this wasn't going to end with one polite conversation. A week later, a certified letter arrived from a law office in San Antonio, informing me that Prairie View Estates was exercising a recorded prescriptive easement across my northeast corner, citing continuous use since before 1990. The claim was absurd. That corner had been fenced cattle pasture my whole life. Dana read the letter twice, then set it down carefully like it might bite her. "Prescriptive easement," she said. "That's not something you get from driving through someone's field for 3 weeks. That's something you fake by claiming decades of use nobody can easily disprove." I felt my jaw tighten. I called a real estate attorney in Kerrville named Priya Shah, who'd handled a boundary dispute for my cousin years back. She read the letter over the phone and laughed once, sharply, not because it was funny but because it was clumsy. "This needs actual survey history," she said.
"Get me."
Priya requested the original 1962 plat from the county archive, along with every amendment filed since. It would take 2 to 3 weeks to process, the clerk warned, because older records were stored off-site in a climate-controlled facility outside Fredericksburg. I hated waiting. Burramore Road. In the meantime, the driving didn't stop. It multiplied. Landscaping trucks, moving vans for new homeowners, even a school bus taking a shortcut some parent must have suggested. My reseated corner turned into a genuine dirt road within days, packed hard enough that grass wouldn't grow back without real work. I put up a simple wire gate across the corner. Nothing dramatic, just enough to say this land is not a thoroughfare. 2 mornings later, I found it cut clean with bolt cutters and dragged off into the ditch. Whoever did it hadn't even bothered to hide the tool marks. I filed a police report for the vandalism. The same deputy came out, took the same kind of photos, and told me without much conviction that gate cutting was hard to prosecute without a witness. I asked if he could at least patrol the road more. He said he'd try. Frank Delgado showed up at my gate that weekend with a thermos of coffee and no agenda except conversation. He told me he'd lived beside 3 HOA presidents before Deborah, and none of them had ever tried something this bold this fast. "She's not just controlling," he said.
"She's building toward."
I asked him what he thought she wanted. He looked out at the torn-up corner of my field and said, "A road wide enough for construction equipment doesn't come from nowhere, Colt. Somebody's planning to build past your property line." not just cross it. I filed that thought away with everything else. Ruthie asked at dinner why strangers kept driving through our field, and I told her some neighbors were confused about the property line. She accepted that the way kids accept most adult explanations, with a shrug and a request for more mashed potatoes. Dana caught my eye across the table. Unconvinced, I replaced the gate with a heavier steel one, padlocked, with a no trespassing, private property sign bolted to the crossbar. Within a week, someone had spray painted over the sign, the message unreadable but the intent obvious. I photographed it, added it to the folder, and repainted the sign myself. Deborah sent a friendly reminder flyer to every Prairie View mailbox describing me as an uncooperative neighbor blocking essential community access, without naming me directly, though everyone knew exactly who she meant. Neighbors I'd waved to for years started avoiding eye contact at the feed store. I hadn't done anything wrong. Priya's paralegal called with an update. The county archive had located the original 1962 plat, but flagged that a duplicate copy, supposedly identical, had been pulled and photocopied by someone claiming to represent a title research firm 2 months earlier, right around the time the SUV first crossed my field. That detail sat wrong with me all night. Someone had gone looking for my grandfather's plat before Deborah ever mentioned an easement, before the first tire track appeared. This wasn't a misunderstanding that grew. This was a plan that started with paperwork and ended with a road across my hayfield. Frank came by again, this time with an old photograph, faded but legible, showing the Hollis pasture boundary line from a 1988 county survey he'd kept from his own land sale. It showed the fence exactly where my fence stood today. No easement, no gap, no gray area anywhere near that corner. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Frank said he'd sold his parcel to Richard Ashcroft's development company years ago, and Richard's team had used this exact photo during negotiations to prove the boundary was clean. Deborah's own husband had this survey, Frank said. She knows there's no easement. She's counting on you not knowing. That was the first real crack I saw in the story, and it didn't come from a lawyer or a county clerk. It came from a neighbor who'd been quietly watching Deborah operate for years, waiting for someone stubborn enough to actually fight back instead of just selling and moving on. I asked Frank why he hadn't said anything sooner, to the board or the county. He looked tired in a specific way, the way people look after losing an argument they knew they were right about. "I tried once," he said. "She got 3 neighbors to accuse me of harassment instead." That night I told Dana everything Frank had shared. She sat with it for a long moment before saying what I was already thinking. "This isn't really about a shortcut anymore," she said. "It's about whether Deborah Ashcroft can push people off their land just by acting certain enough about it." The HOA posted a community-wide email calling an emergency meeting to resolve the Northeast access matter. I wasn't invited as a participant, only as a subject of discussion, which told me everything about how Deborah intended to run the conversation. I decided to show up anyway, folder in hand. Priya couldn't attend on short notice, but she coached me over the phone the night before. "Don't argue emotion," she said. "Bring dates." Let her overreach in front of witnesses. People like her eventually say too much when they think the room already agrees with them. I took the advice. The clubhouse was packed the night of the meeting. More people than I'd ever seen at one of these gatherings before. Deborah stood at the podium in a blazer that looked expensive and rehearsed, flanked by 2 board members who nodded whenever she paused for breath. I sat in the back row. She opened by describing me, again without naming me directly, as someone obstructing safe access for emergency vehicles, which was news to me since no fire truck had ever once used that corner of my field in 22 years. A few neighbors murmured agreement. Others glanced back toward where I sat. When she opened the floor, I stood and asked one simple question. Can you show this room the recorded easement document with a case number filed at the county? The room went quiet. Deborah said her attorney was finalizing the filing. I asked how a right you're still filing could already justify driving through my fence. A board member named Carl Whitfield, the HOA treasurer, shifted visibly in his seat. He didn't say anything that night, but I noticed him afterward, lingering by the door instead of leaving with the rest of the board, like something was bothering him that he wasn't ready to say out loud. Deborah recovered quickly, pivoting to talk about community safety and property values, language that got easy nods from newer homeowners who barely knew me or my land. She closed the meeting by promising a resolution within the month, which sounded less like a promise and more like a countdown. Outside afterward, Carl Whitfield caught up to me in the parking lot, glancing back at the clubhouse before speaking low. I've seen the HOA budget, he said. There's a line item for access improvement consulting that's been running for 4 months, way before any of this became public. I asked who was paid. A firm called Meridian Site Partners, Carl said. I looked them up once out of curiosity. Same address as Richard's brokerage office. He wouldn't say more that night, glancing nervously toward the clubhouse windows, but he told me to keep my folder growing, because he had a feeling he'd need it too eventually. I drove home with more questions than answers. Meridian Site Partners, sharing an address with Richard Ashcroft's office, being paid HOA dues money for access improvement for months before anyone mentioned an easement to me. This wasn't a neighbor confused about a shortcut. This was a plan with a budget line. Priya requested public records on Meridian Site Partners the next morning. It took 3 days to get anything useful, but what came back confirmed Carl's tip. Richard Ashcroft was listed as a managing partner, formed the same year Prairie View broke ground, specializing in land acquisition and development facilitation. My stomach turned. Dana found the piece I'd missed while I was busy staring at fence posts. Development facilitation, she said, reading over my shoulder. That's a nice way of saying they help builders get land they don't own yet. She was right, and I hated how obvious it seemed once someone finally said it plainly. That weekend, another vehicle crossed my field, this time a survey crew with orange stakes and a total station, marking a straight line clean through my northeast corner and continuing past my fence into the unbuilt scrubland beyond it. Land that belonged to nobody yet because it belonged to me. I confronted the survey crew directly. The lead surveyor, a young guy who looked like he just wanted to finish his shift, said he'd been hired by Meridian Site Partners to stake Phase 4 right-of-way. I told him he was staking a road across private property with no easement, and he actually stopped working. He called his supervisor, who arrived 20 minutes later looking irritated, not at me but at whoever had sent his crew out with incomplete paperwork. He apologized, said this happens sometimes when developers got ahead of themselves, and pulled his crew off my land. It was the first small win I'd had. I photographed every stake before removing them myself, adding fresh entries to my folder: date, company name, supervisor's apology on record. Priya said this was gold, evidence that Meridian was actively planning construction through land it had no legal claim to, weeks before any easement paperwork had even been filed. Deborah must have heard about the survey crew retreating, because 2 days later a new letter arrived. This one threatening legal action for interference with essential infrastructure planning, if I didn't allow temporary access, while the matter was resolved through proper channels. The tone had shifted from friendly to openly hostile. Priya reviewed the letter and told me plainly it had no legal teeth. Just intimidation dressed up in official language. "She's hoping you'll cave before you check," Priya said. "People usually do. For a paper fight. She's counting on you being like most folks." I wasn't most folks. Not about this land. My grandfather cleared that corner with a mule team in 1961. My father was born in the farmhouse that used to stand where our current barn sits now. Deborah could send all the letters she wanted. That corner wasn't going to become her road. Frank stopped by again, this time bringing his adult son Miguel, a quiet kid in his early 20s who worked part-time doing drone photography for local real estate listings. "Show him," Frank said. Miguel pulled out his phone and showed me aerial footage he'd shot months earlier. Before any of this started, the footage showed my northeast corner exactly as it should be. Fenced, undisturbed, grass unbroken by any tire track. Dated back in the fall before Deborah ever mentioned an easement. Miguel had shot it for an unrelated listing near Prairie View and happened to capture my land in the background. "Would you be willing to keep flying that route?" I asked him. Miguel glanced at his father, who nodded. "If it helps prove what's actually happening," Miguel said. "I don't mind." That small offer would end up mattering more than any of us realized sitting in my kitchen that afternoon. For a few days, things went quiet. No vehicles, no letters, no survey crews. Dana said it felt like the calm right before a storm rolls over the hill country, when the cattle bunch up along the fence line and the air goes still. I didn't trust the quiet for 1 second. I used the lull to reinforce my fence properly, running new steel T-posts and heavy-gauge wire along the entire northeast corner, closing off any casual crossing point. It wasn't a fortress, just an honest fence doing an honest job, the kind my grandfather would have approved of without needing an explanation. Priya called with an update during the quiet stretch. The county clerk had finally released the full 1962 plat and every amendment on file. Nothing, anywhere, in 60 years of paperwork, showed an easement across my northeast corner. Deborah's claim had no legal foundation at all, not even a weak one. "So why is she still pushing this?" Dana asked when I shared the news. Priya's answer stuck with me. "Because until you push back hard enough in public, the paperwork doesn't matter to her. People like this rely on momentum and reputation, not documents. She needs you to fold before anyone checks." I asked Priya what our next move should be. She suggested formally requesting, in writing, that the HOA produce the recorded easement or cease all further access claims immediately, copying the county attorney's office. It would put everything on record and force Deborah to either produce proof or back down publicly. We sent the letter that Friday. Within 48 hours, instead of backing down, Deborah escalated in a direction none of us expected, filing a formal complaint with county code enforcement, claiming my unauthorized fencing violated an emergency access ordinance meant for wildfire evacuation routes in unincorporated areas near new developments. A code enforcement officer named Ruben Castillo showed up unannounced, polite but clearly following a checklist someone had handed him. He measured my new fence, photographed the gate, and told me the complaint alleged my property blocked the only viable evacuation route for Prairie View residents in case of wildfire. I walked Reuben to the western edge of my property and showed him the county road, paved, maintained, running directly to the subdivision's main entrance, wide enough for fire trucks and moving vans alike. That's the evacuation route, I said. It's been there since before Prairie View existed. This is a hay field. Reuben looked at the paved road, then back at my fence, and shook his head slightly, the look of a man realizing he'd been sent to enforce a complaint that didn't hold up to 5 minutes of common sense. He told me he'd note his findings and file a report either way. The lull, turned out, hadn't been a retreat at all. It had been Deborah regrouping, shifting from a weak civil claim to a government complaint designed to make me look like the danger, the neighbor risking lives instead of the one defending 60 years of clean, undisputed ownership. Dana said what worried her most wasn't the fence complaint itself, since it was obviously baseless, but the pattern underneath it. She's not trying to win one argument, Dana said. She's trying to make sure that whatever argument she loses, there's already another one waiting to take its place. I mentioned that to Priya, who agreed and warned me this was common with people who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy. The goal isn't a single victory, she said. It's exhaustion. It's easier to sell a corner of your ranch than keep fighting complaint after complaint. That was the moment I understood the shape of the fight I was actually in. This wasn't about one field or one gate. It was about whether a woman with a clipboard and a compliant board could outweigh a family that had held this land through droughts, recessions, and worse neighbors than her. Carl Whitfield reached out again, this time by text instead of a parking lot whisper, asking to meet somewhere away from Prairie View entirely. We agreed on a diner off the highway, the kind of place where nobody from the subdivision would recognize either of us sitting in a corner booth together. Carl looked genuinely nervous when he sat down, turning his coffee cup in slow circles before speaking. I've been treasurer for 2 years, he said. I've watched Deborah move HOA dues around in ways I couldn't always explain to myself, let alone to the board. This access thing feels different. Bigger. He told me the access improvement consulting line item had grown 3 times since summer, funneling homeowner dues toward Meridian Site Partners for services Carl had never actually seen documented. No reports, no deliverables, just invoices Deborah approved personally without full board review, which technically violated HOA bylaws requiring dual signatures. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Carl exhaled slowly. Because I have a daughter starting kindergarten this fall, he said. And I don't want her growing up thinking this is what leadership looks like. I want to do the right thing before I convince myself it's too complicated to bother. I asked if he'd be willing to put any of this in writing eventually, understanding he might not be ready yet. Carl said he needed time, that Deborah still controlled his access to certain records, and that moving too fast could get him removed from the board before he'd gathered enough proof. We left the diner with an unspoken agreement. Carl would keep watching quietly from inside. I would keep documenting from outside. And eventually, if things kept escalating the way they seemed to be heading, our 2 folders might end up telling the same story from 2 very different vantage points. That night, Miguel sent Frank a text with new drone footage, this time showing something unexpected. A backhoe, unmarked, parked overnight just inside the Prairie View boundary line, close enough to my fence that its bucket could reach my northeast corner without the operator even needing to reposition the machine. Frank forwarded it to me immediately. I drove out at dusk and confirmed it myself. A rented backhoe sitting quiet in the tall grass. No permit sign. No construction fencing. Nothing indicating legitimate work. I photographed it from the county road, careful to stay clearly on public right-of-way while doing so. Priya said this changed things. Staging heavy equipment near a disputed boundary, without permits, while a fence complaint against me was still technically under review, suggested Deborah wasn't waiting for any legal outcome at all. She was preparing to force the issue physically, regardless of what the county eventually decided. I called Ruben Castillo the next morning, mentioning the backhoe as a follow-up to his fence complaint visit. He sounded surprised, said no permit had been pulled for equipment staging near my property, and promised to look into it, though he cautioned that enforcement on unpermitted equipment could take time. Dana wanted to know if we should involve the sheriff's office again. Priya advised against it just yet, saying we needed the equipment actually used against my property before it became a criminal matter rather than a permitting dispute. Right now, she said, it's suspicious. We need it to become undeniable. Undeniable came faster than any of us expected. 2 nights later, at nearly 11 o'clock, Miguel's drone camera, left recording on a scheduled overnight pass, caught the backhoe rolling slowly toward my fence line, headlights off, operated by someone wearing a Prairie View maintenance vest despite the late, unusual hour. Miguel called me immediately, voice tight with adrenaline, describing what he was watching live on his phone screen. I told Dana to stay with Ruthie and drove out to my northeast corner in the dark. Headlights off myself, parking on the county road to watch without announcing my arrival too soon. From a distance, I watched the backhoe's bucket lower toward my fence, engine idling low, the operator glancing around like he expected someone to intervene. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line immediately, reporting active trespassing and property damage in progress, giving my location and a description of the unmarked equipment. While waiting for a deputy, I approached carefully on foot, staying on my side of the fence, and called out asking the operator what he thought he was doing on private property after dark. He froze, cut the engine, and admitted he'd been told the fence was already approved for removal. Approved by who? I asked. He hesitated, then said Prairie View's HOA president had told him personally that the county had cleared temporary access removal pending the ordinance review, and that he'd been paid in cash to finish the job quietly before anyone noticed in the morning light. A deputy arrived 12 minutes later, lights off per my request to avoid tipping anyone off unnecessarily, and took the operator's statement directly. The operator, clearly rattled and unwilling to take a criminal charge for someone else's plan, repeated what he'd told me, adding Deborah's name without me ever prompting him to. The deputy documented everything, photographed the backhoe's position relative to my fence line, and informed the operator that no county approval existed for any access removal, and that he was now looking at a criminal trespassing and property damage complaint unless he cooperated fully with the investigation going forward. I stood in the dark, cold air settling over the field, and felt something shift for the first time since this whole mess began. Deborah had finally done something that couldn't be explained away with a smile and a clipboard. There was a name attached to a crime now, and it was hers. The operator, a subcontractor named Denny Ruiz, agreed to give a full written statement the next day in exchange for the department noting his cooperation. He said Deborah had approached him directly, outside normal HOA channels, offering cash specifically because she didn't want the job going through any official maintenance contract. Denny's statement, once filed, mentioned something that made Priya sit up straighter when she read it. Deborah had told him the fence removal needed to happen before the anniversary, a phrase Denny found strange enough to remember, though he had no idea what anniversary she could possibly have meant. None of us knew either. Not yet, but Frank's face changed when I mentioned it to him over the phone that night. He went quiet for a long moment before saying he needed to check something in his own old paperwork, something he hadn't thought about in years, and would call me back. Frank called back 2 days later, sounding shaken in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He asked to meet in person, said this wasn't something he wanted to explain over the phone, and that it involved a part of Prairie View's history nobody currently living there actually remembered anymore. We met at his kitchen table, Miguel sitting quietly beside him. Frank pulled out an old photograph, black and white, showing 2 families standing near a fence line decades ago. One of them clearly a younger version of my own grandfather, the other a family Frank identified as the original Hollis family. There's someone else in this photo you'll recognize, Frank said, pointing to a young girl standing slightly apart from both families, arms crossed, watching the adults instead of playing. That's Deborah. Land before it was sold off for the subdivision. This was her childhood home. I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the sullen little girl in it with the woman who'd been sending me threatening letters for months. Frank explained that the Hollis family had lost most of their pasture in a boundary dispute with my grandfather back in the 60s, a dispute they'd lost fairly, according to old county records Frank still had from his own land purchase. The Hollis family had once claimed the exact same northeast corner Deborah was now fighting over, decades before any HOA existed. My grandfather had won that dispute legally, with clean paperwork, the same paperwork Priya had already pulled. She's not fighting for an HOA road, Frank said quietly. She's finishing a fight her family lost before she was old enough to understand it. The anniversary Denny mentioned. That's probably the anniversary of the day her family lost that corner. She's been carrying this a long time. Colt, Dana, sitting beside me as Frank explained all this, said what none of us wanted to say out loud first. That doesn't make her sympathetic, Dana said. It makes her dangerous. Wrong will justify almost anything to themselves. That's not an excuse. That's a warning. I didn't feel sorry for Deborah. Not exactly. But something about the photograph settled a piece of the puzzle into place. This had never been about Prairie View's convenience or emergency access routes. It was personal, buried under decades of polished HOA language and Richard's development ambitions, but personal all the same. Priya said the childhood connection, while not legally relevant on its own, explained the pattern of behavior perfectly. Obsessive, personal, willing to fabricate documents and stage equipment in the dark. People fighting old ghosts don't stop at cease and desist letters, she said.
We need to prepare for her.
Prepare turned out to be exactly the right word. 2 days after Denny's statement went on record, Deborah requested an emergency HOA board meeting, closed to general members, where she reportedly accused Carl Whitfield of leaking confidential financial information, though nobody outside the board had said anything publicly yet. Carl texted me that night, shaken, saying Deborah had all but accused him directly during the closed session, watching his face the entire time for a reaction. He hadn't confirmed anything to her, but he was certain now that she suspected him, and that his window to act safely was closing fast. "I think it's time," Carl said. He agreed to give Priya a formal statement about the Meridian Site Partners invoices and the unauthorized single signature approvals, understanding it might cost him his board seat, possibly his standing in the neighborhood entirely, but he said he'd rather lose that than his own conscience. Priya took Carl's statement the following afternoon, cross-referencing it against the public records she'd already pulled on Meridian. The pattern was clear now. HOA dues funneling into a company owned by Deborah's husband, timed suspiciously close to a manufactured easement claim against a piece of land Deborah's family had lost generations earlier. "This isn't just a boundary dispute anymore," Priya told me over the phone. "This looks like fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and possibly conspiracy to commit theft by deception if they'd actually managed to force a sale. We have enough now to take this to the district attorney's office, not just civil court." I felt something like relief hearing that, the first real sense that this fight might end somewhere solid instead of dragging on forever through letters and lawyers. But Frank warned me not to relax yet. "Cornered people don't calm down," he said.
They get louder, right?
He was right to warn me. Deborah shifted tactics again, this time going public in a way none of us had anticipated. Posting in the Prairie View community app that I had threatened an HOA hired worker with violence during the backhoe incident, twisting the confrontation into something it never was. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me directly started leaving comments beneath her post, some defending me based on nothing but instinct, others repeating her framing without question. Dana wanted to respond publicly and correct the record immediately. Priya advised patience instead, warning that public arguments rarely change minds already made up. "Let her keep talking," Priya said. "Every public statement she makes that isn't true becomes something we can use later, especially once law enforcement gets involved. Right now she thinks she's controlling the narrative. She doesn't know yet how much rope she's giving herself." It was hard advice to follow, but I trusted it. Miguel kept flying his scheduled overnight passes, careful and consistent, documenting my fence line without ever crossing onto Prairie View property himself. Frank reviewed each pass personally, cataloging anything unusual. For nearly a week, nothing happened, just quiet footage of an undisturbed fence line under starlight, boring in the best possible way. The quiet broke on a Thursday, when Ruben Castillo called to say county code enforcement had officially closed my fence complaint, finding no ordinance violation whatsoever, and had opened a new investigation instead into unpermitted equipment staging near residential boundary lines, directly citing the backhoe incident from 2 weeks earlier. That should have been good news. Clean vindication from the county itself. But Deborah didn't take the closure quietly. She called an all-members meeting, not a board session this time, framing it as an urgent community safety briefing about what she called increasingly hostile behavior from the Bennett Ranch. I debated skipping it entirely, tired of standing in rooms defending myself against accusations built on nothing. Priya insisted I attend anyway, this time with her sitting beside me, folder in hand, ready to speak if things went the direction she suspected they might, given how cornered Deborah now clearly was. The clubhouse was even fuller than before, word having spread about the backhoe incident despite Deborah's attempts to control the story. Deborah opened by describing a concerning pattern of aggression from my direction, careful never to mention the sheriff's report or Denny Ruiz's statement that contradicted her version completely. When she opened the floor, Priya stood before I could, introducing herself calmly as my attorney and asking one direct question. Has the board reviewed the sheriff's incident report from 2 weeks ago, which names Deborah Ashcroft as the person who authorized unpermitted equipment on private property after dark? The room went still in a different way than before. Less curious murmuring, more genuine shock rippling through rows of neighbors who clearly hadn't heard this particular detail. Deborah's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered, insisting the report was misleading and that Denny Ruiz had misunderstood instructions. Priya calmly read Denny's written statement aloud, word for word, including the part about cash payment specifically to avoid official maintenance contracts. A woman near the front, someone I didn't recognize, said out loud, "Wait, she paid someone in cash to remove his fence at night." Nobody answered her directly. Carl Whitfield stood up from the board table, visibly trembling but steady in his voice, and said he could no longer stay silent about financial irregularities he'd observed regarding HOA dues and a company called Meridian Site Partners, owned by Deborah's husband, receiving payments for services nobody on the board had verified. Deborah's composure finally cracked in front of the whole room. "This is outrageous," she said, voice rising. "Carl, you signed off on those invoices yourself." Carl replied quietly that HOA bylaws required 2 signatures for expenditures over a certain threshold, and that his signature had appeared on documents he'd never actually reviewed. A murmur spread through the crowd, uncomfortable now instead of curious, the kind of murmur that happens when a room realizes it's been trusting the wrong person for longer than anyone wants to admit. Deborah tried to regain control, calling for order, but the meeting had already slipped past her grip. One of the newer board members, a quiet man named Alvin Park who'd rarely spoken at previous meetings, asked to see the invoices Carl mentioned, right there, on the spot. Deborah said the documents were at home, a claim that landed badly given how prepared she'd been for every previous confrontation. Priya suggested, calmly but firmly, that the board consider suspending Deborah's authority to approve expenditures until an independent audit could review the past year of HOA finances, citing the bylaws Carl had just described. Several board members, visibly rattled, agreed it seemed like a reasonable precaution given everything just revealed. Deborah left the meeting early, citing a prior commitment, though nobody believed that for a second watching her walk briskly to her car, phone already pressed to her ear before she'd even reached the parking lot. I stayed behind, answering neighbors' questions honestly for the first time in months. Several people apologized directly, saying they'd trusted Deborah's version of events without ever hearing mine. I told them there was nothing to apologize for, that she'd counted on exactly that kind of trust to make her plan work. Dana squeezed my hand as we finally walked out into the parking lot. I thought, driving home that night, that maybe the worst of it was over, that exposure in front of 200 neighbors would be enough to make Deborah retreat, cut her losses, and quietly disappear from HOA leadership the way people usually do once their credibility collapses in public like that. I was wrong. Cornered people get reckless, and Deborah proved it faster than any of us expected. 2 nights after that meeting, Miguel's drone footage caught something none of us saw coming. Not a backhoe this time, but Deborah herself, alone, walking my fence line after midnight. Miguel called immediately, describing what he watched live. Deborah moving slowly along my property line with something in her hand he couldn't identify clearly from the drone's altitude. I told him to keep the footage rolling and stay well clear, then called the sheriff's non-emergency line for the second time. I drove out again, keeping my distance, watching from the county road as Deborah crouched near my fence post, working at something with what turned out to be, once the deputy arrived and got close enough, a pair of bolt cutters, the same tool that had cut my original wire gate months ago. The deputy who responded recognized the situation immediately, given the standing report already on file about vandalism at that exact location. He approached Deborah directly, and I watched from a distance as her posture changed completely. No clipboard, no confident smile, just a woman caught kneeling in the dark with cutting tools. She claimed she'd been checking on community safety concerns, an explanation that made even less sense once the deputy asked why she was carrying bolt cutters instead of a flashlight. He detained her for questioning, and I finally allowed myself to walk closer once he waved me forward to confirm the property line. Standing there in the cold with a deputy's flashlight illuminating my torn wire and Deborah's bolt cutters lying in the grass between us, I felt something complicated, not triumph exactly, more like the specific exhaustion of watching a long, unnecessary fight finally reach a moment that couldn't be argued away anymore. The deputy asked if I wanted to press charges for the vandalism. Both this incident and the earlier cut gate now clearly connected by the matching tool marks Priya had photographed months before. I said yes without hesitation. Some fights end with forgiveness. This one had earned something more formal than that. Deborah was cited that night for criminal mischief and released pending further investigation. Her composed public image reduced to a single line in a police report alongside Denny Ruiz's earlier statement and Carl's financial disclosures. Felt, finally, like the paperwork I'd been collecting for months was starting to matter. Word spread through Prairie View faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. By morning, neighbors were messaging each other screenshots of the police blotter, and the community app that Deborah had used to accuse me weeks earlier filled instead with people asking pointed questions about her judgment and leadership entirely. The board called an emergency session the next day, this time without Deborah presiding, since bylaws required recusal for any member facing active criminal charges connected to HOA business. Alvin Park, the quiet board member, was asked to chair the meeting temporarily, and he accepted with visible reluctance but clear resolve. Priya attended on my behalf again, presenting the full folder of evidence we'd built over months. Dated photographs, the sheriff's reports, Denny's statement, Carl's financial disclosures, and the county's confirmation that no easement had ever legally existed anywhere near my property. The board listened in near total silence throughout. Carl formally requested an independent forensic audit of HOA finances covering the past 18 months, specifically targeting the Meridian Site Partners payments. The board approved it unanimously, including the two members who'd previously seemed most loyal to Deborah, their loyalty apparently having limits once criminal charges entered the conversation. I didn't feel the need to gloat, watching people who doubted me a month earlier now scrambling to distance themselves from Deborah's decisions. Dana said later she was proud of how I'd handled it, staying quiet, letting the evidence speak instead of turning the meeting into a moment about my own vindication. Richard Ashcroft, notably, hadn't appeared at any meeting throughout this entire saga, staying carefully separate from his wife's HOA activities on paper, even while his company collected payments funneled through her position. Priya said that separation likely wouldn't hold up once investigators started tracing the money more formally through subpoenas. Sure enough, within a week, the district attorney's office confirmed it was reviewing the case, not just for the vandalism and trespassing, but for potential fraud connected to the fabricated easement claim and the misuse of HOA funds routed toward Meridian site partners without proper board authorization or disclosure. Denny Ruiz agreed to testify formally if needed, saying he wanted no part in whatever else Deborah might have been planning beyond the one night he'd been paid to work. His cooperation, combined with Carl's financial records, gave investigators a clear timeline stretching back nearly 5 months before I'd noticed anything wrong. Frank, watching all of this unfold, seemed almost sad rather than satisfied, which surprised me until he explained why. "I know what it's like to lose land your family loved," he said. "I don't excuse what she did, but I understand, a little, how someone convinces themselves this is justice instead of theft." Dana didn't share Frank's sympathy. And honestly, neither did I. Not fully. Whatever grief Deborah carried about her childhood home didn't give her the right to forge documents, stage machinery in the dark, or cut fences twice with the same pair of bolt cutters. Old wounds don't excuse new crimes. The investigation moved faster than Priya expected, partly because Carl's meticulous records gave investigators an unusually clean paper trail to follow. Within 3 weeks, the county forensic auditor confirmed nearly $40,000 in HOA dues had been funneled to Meridian site partners for services that were never actually performed. Richard Ashcroft's development company, turned out, had been quietly negotiating with an outside builder to expand Prairie View's footprint using land that would only become available if Deborah successfully forced my sale, a detail that finally explained the entire scale of motive behind months of letters, surveys, and threats. That detail landed hardest with me, more than the bolt cutters, more than the backhoe in the dark. This had never really been just about an old childhood grudge. It had also been, underneath everything, a calculated business deal that treated my family's land like inventory waiting to be acquired. The district attorney's office formally charged Deborah with criminal mischief, filing false statements to a government agency regarding the fabricated easement, and misappropriation of association funds. A combination serious enough that her attorney immediately began discussing a plea arrangement rather than risking a trial in front of a jury. The HOA board, meeting without Deborah for the 3rd consecutive session, voted to remove her from the presidency entirely, citing both the criminal charges and the bylaws violations Carl had documented. The vote was unanimous, including from board members who'd defended her loudly just 2 months earlier. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact with me at the feed store started stopping to apologize directly, some awkwardly, some with real remorse, admitting they'd believed Deborah's version of events simply because she'd said it with such confidence. I told most of them the same thing. Confidence isn't evidence. I understood the confusion. Miguel's drone footage, once Priya submitted it formally to investigators, became a key piece of evidence, showing a clear timeline from the untouched fence line months earlier to the staged backhoe to Deborah herself caught with bolt cutters in hand. Frank told his son he was proud in a way I rarely heard him say things. Richard Ashcroft resigned from his own brokerage under pressure once local news picked up the story. A small piece at first, then a longer feature once reporters realized the story combined fraud, a childhood grudge, and steel bollards into something genuinely compelling for readers well beyond our own county lines. I hadn't installed the bollards yet at that point, but the story had already started calling ahead to that detail, since Priya mentioned during one interview that I intended to permanently secure the boundary with reinforced steel posts, immovable by any vehicle, the moment the criminal case allowed final fence repairs. Dana worried briefly about the attention, wondering if reporters camping near our gate might upset Ruthie's routine or draw unwanted visitors out to gawk at the Steel Bollard Rancher, as one headline had already dubbed me. I promised her I'd handle it quietly, the same way I'd handled everything else so far. Carl Whitfield, despite losing his seat on the board voluntarily once the audit concluded, told me privately he felt lighter than he had in over a year. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business to question her, he said. Turns out silence was never actually neutral. It was just cover for her. Frank's old photograph of Deborah as a child ended up matching less to the legal case than any of us expected, since courts care about evidence, not motive alone. But it mattered enormously to me personally. A quiet reminder that even the people who wrong us carry histories worth understanding, not excusing. The forensic audit eventually traced the full scope of misused funds, confirming Deborah had personally approved every Meridian payment without required board oversight, using her position not just to chase an old grudge but to steer real money toward her husband's company under the cover of legitimate community improvement projects. I met with Priya to finalize my own civil claim against Deborah and the HOA for property damage, legal fees, and the emotional toll of months spent defending land my family had held honestly for over 60 years. Priya said the criminal case alone would likely make my civil claim straightforward. Deborah's attorney reached out to Priya, requesting a settlement conversation before the criminal case proceeded further, hoping a quick civil resolution might soften how the judge eventually viewed her cooperation. Priya relayed the offer to me plainly, without pushing me either direction, respecting that this decision needed to be mine alone. I thought about it for exactly one evening, sitting on the porch watching Ruthie chase fireflies near the very fence line that had caused so much trouble. I told Priya the next morning I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. I wanted this handled fully, in the open, the way it deserved. I'm not doing this for revenge, I told Dana that night. I'm doing it because Ruthie needs to grow up understanding that people who lie and cut fences in the dark don't get to just write a check and disappear quietly. Some things need to actually finish, not just fade away unresolved. Priya respected the decision completely, saying most of her clients eventually chose the harder path once they realized quiet settlements mostly protected the wrongdoer's reputation, not the victim's peace of mind. We proceeded toward a full civil hearing, scheduled to follow shortly after Deborah's criminal case concluded in county court. In the weeks leading up to both proceedings, I focused on something Priya called closing the story properly, which meant finally installing the steel bollards along my northeast corner, not out of anger, but as a plain, permanent statement that this boundary would never again be treated as negotiable by anyone. I ordered a dozen heavy steel posts, the kind used to protect storefronts from vehicle ramming, and spent 3 full days setting them deep in concrete along the exact fence line Deborah had once claimed didn't legally exist. Frank helped me dig half the holes himself, refusing payment, calling it closing a debt. Miguel documented the installation with his drone, this time for a purpose that felt almost celebratory rather than investigative, capturing steady footage of steel posts rising along ground that had been fought over for nearly 6 months. Ruthie painted a small welcome sign for the gate, unrelated to any of the drama. The morning I finished setting the last bollard, a local news crew asked to film the completed boundary for their ongoing coverage of the case. I agreed, mostly because I wanted the record to show clearly, in plain daylight, exactly what an honest, undisputed property line was supposed to look like, standing there answering the reporter's questions. I found myself less angry than I expected to feel, describing the whole ordeal calmly, focusing on the facts rather than my own frustration. The reporter asked why steel instead of simple wire again. I told her some lessons deserve a fence that can't be argued with. That clip ended up circulating widely online, people picking up on the phrase without much context, turning a fence that can't be argued with into something of a local saying whenever neighbors discussed boundary disputes at the feed store or the diner off the highway where Carl and I had first talked. Deborah's criminal hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in late autumn. The clubhouse parking lot empty for once. Everyone instead crowded into the small county courthouse downtown. I sat beside Dana, Priya beside me, Frank and Carl a few rows back. Miguel quietly recording nothing, respecting the courtroom's rules completely. Deborah looked smaller somehow in the courtroom, stripped of her HOA blazer and clipboard, just a woman in a plain gray suit sitting beside her attorney. Richard sat behind her, not beside her, a small detail that told its own quiet story about where their partnership stood after everything had unraveled publicly. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically, starting with the fabricated easement claim, moving through the staged backhoe incident, Denny Ruiz's testimony, and finally the night Deborah herself was caught with bolt cutters at my fence line, the same tool marks matching an earlier vandalism report filed months before that incident. Denny Ruiz testified plainly, without embellishment, describing exactly how Deborah had approached him privately, offering cash specifically to avoid official channels. His straightforward manner seemed to land well with the judge, who asked few follow-up questions, the story apparently speaking clearly enough on its own without much additional clarification needed. Carl testified next, walking the court through the Meridian Site Partners invoices, the missing dual signatures, and the moment he'd finally decided silence wasn't neutral anymore. His voice shook slightly at first, then steadied as he spoke, visibly relieved to finally say everything he'd been carrying quietly for so long. When Priya presented Miguel's drone footage, time-stamped and consistent across months, showing the fence line's transformation from undisturbed grass to staged equipment to Deborah, herself caught mid-vandalism, the courtroom stayed completely silent, the footage doing more to establish the timeline than any single witness testimony could have managed alone. Deborah's attorney attempted to frame everything as a misunderstanding escalated by miscommunication between neighbors, but the judge, reviewing the fabricated easement claim alongside the financial audit, seemed unconvinced that months of forged documents and staged nighttime equipment qualified as simple miscommunication between two reasonable adjacent property owners. When it came time for Deborah to speak, she stood slowly, and for the first time in this entire saga, I watched her composure fully break, not into anger this time, but into something quieter and more exhausted, the mask finally too heavy to hold up any longer in front of everyone watching. She admitted, haltingly, that the easement claim had never been real, that she'd known it wasn't real from the beginning, and that some part of her had genuinely believed reclaiming that corner would finally settle something from her childhood that had never felt settled, no matter how many years had passed since. I told myself it belonged to my family first, she said quietly. I told myself Colt's grandfather took advantage of mine. I don't know anymore if that's even true. I just know I let an old story convince me I was allowed to do things I would never have allowed anyone else to do. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and I felt no satisfaction watching her say it. Only a tired kind of clarity, the sense that this whole ordeal had never really been about roads or easements at all, but about a grief nobody ever properly resolved. The judge sentenced Deborah to probation, community service, mandatory restitution covering both my property damage and the misappropriated HOA funds, and a formal restraining order preventing any contact with me or my property going forward. Richard, separately, faced his own civil liability for Meridian's role in the fraudulent invoicing scheme. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters gathered near the steps, but I didn't feel much urge to give a lengthy statement. I simply said the ruling confirmed what my family's paperwork had said all along, that the land was mine, honestly held, and that no amount of pressure had ever changed that fact. Dana squeezed my hand as we walked to the truck, Ruthie's small painted welcome sign still sitting in the back seat where she'd left it that morning. It's over, Dana said. Not as a question but as a quiet statement she needed to hear out loud after months of waiting for exactly this moment. I wasn't entirely sure over was the right word yet. Not with the civil case still pending and the HOA still working through its own restructuring under new leadership. But standing there in the parking lot with my family beside me, it certainly felt closer to over than it had in a long time. Carl was formally invited back onto the HOA board the following month, this time as vice president under Alvin Park's new leadership, both men committing publicly to full financial transparency and independent annual audits going forward, a small but meaningful attempt to rebuild trust the community hadn't realized it had lost. Frank's photograph of young Deborah standing near the old fence line found its way, oddly, into a community history display Alvin organized at the clubhouse, not as an indictment, but as a reminder of how neighborhoods change hands, how old griefs can curdle into new harm if nobody addresses them honestly. I wasn't sure I agreed with framing it that gently, but I understood Alvin's instinct to try building something constructive out of the wreckage rather than simply moving on and pretending none of it had happened. Prairie View, for better or worse, would carry the story in its history now. The civil case settled a few weeks later, not through the quiet arrangement Deborah's attorney had first proposed, but through a full public judgment covering property damage, legal fees, and additional compensation acknowledging the deliberate, sustained nature of the harassment my family had endured for the better part of 6 months. Priya said it was one of the cleanest cases she'd handled in years, mostly because the evidence had practically built itself once people like Frank, Miguel, and Carl decided quietly, independently, that watching silently was no longer something they could live with comfortably, each contributing a piece nobody else could have provided. Deborah moved away from Prairie View entirely by early winter, selling her house quickly, quietly, without any farewell gathering or announcement in the community app she'd once used so freely. Richard's development plans through Meridian Site Partners collapsed completely once investors learned the full extent of the fraud investigation. I heard secondhand, through Frank, that Deborah had relocated somewhere near her extended family a few counties over, though nobody I knew maintained any contact with her afterward. And honestly, nobody seemed particularly interested in changing that arrangement. Some chapters simply close, without needing a dramatic final scene to mark the ending. Life on the ranch slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Cattle grazing undisturbed along the northeast corner. The steel bollards standing quiet and unremarkable most days. Exactly the way a boundary should stand. Noticed only when it's actually needed. Otherwise simply doing its job without any fuss or attention. Ruthie's painted welcome sign eventually found a permanent spot on the new gate. Faded slightly by weather within a year. But still legible. Still cheerful. A small reminder that even the corner of land fought over so bitterly could still be, at the end of the day, simply a place children played. Dana started teaching a unit in her classroom, loosely inspired by everything that happened, about property rights and community responsibility. Careful never to name specific people, but hoping her students might grow up understanding that documentation, patience, and quiet allies matter more than confidence alone when facing an unfair situation. Carl and I became genuine friends afterward. Something neither of us expected given how our first real conversation happened in a nervous parking lot exchange. He said watching me refuse to fold had given him the courage to stop staying quiet himself. And I told him his courage had mattered just as much as mine. Frank never fully shook a certain heaviness whenever the subject came up, understanding Deborah's motives in a way the rest of us couldn't quite access. But he seemed at peace with how it ended, telling me once that justice and understanding weren't opposites, just two things that could sit uncomfortably side by side. Miguel's drone business grew unexpectedly after local news coverage mentioned his footage repeatedly. Several neighbors hiring him for legitimate property documentation once they understood how valuable a clear, honest record could be during any dispute, boundary related or otherwise. A small silver lining nobody had anticipated from such a stressful season. The HOA under Alvin's leadership implemented mandatory dual signature approval for any expenditure over $500. Along with quarterly public financial summaries posted directly to the community app. Changes born directly from watching how easily unchecked authority had nearly cost an honest family their land through nothing but paperwork and confidence. I still think sometimes about that old photograph Frank showed me. Young Deborah standing apart from both families near a fence line that would end up matching so much decades later. Grief, left untreated long enough, apparently doesn't just fade quietly. Sometimes it waits, patiently, for a clipboard and an HOA gavel. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Deborah was caught with bolt cutters at my fence, Dana and I hosted a small cookout. Nothing fancy, just Frank, Miguel, Carl, and a handful of neighbors who'd stood by us honestly once the truth finally came out into the open for everyone to see. Standing near the steel bollards that evening, watching Ruthie chase fireflies again exactly the way she had the night I decided to fight the settlement offer instead of accepting it quietly, I felt something settle fully in my chest for the first time in over a year. Something close to actual peace. Priya joined us briefly that evening too, raising a glass of sweet tea toward the fence line and saying simply, "To boundaries that hold." It wasn't a fancy toast, but everyone at that cookout understood exactly what she meant by it, and nobody needed her to explain the phrase any further than that. I thought about writing all of this down for a long time before finally deciding to. Not for sympathy, and not really for anger either, but because Frank once told me stories like this matter most when they're told honestly, without smoothing over the uncomfortable parts just to make the ending feel cleaner. People sometimes ask if I regret how far I let it go before fighting back properly. Whether I should have caved earlier just to avoid months of stress. I always tell them the same thing. Some ground isn't just soil. It's every person who worked it honestly before you, trusting you to hold it. My grandfather cleared that northeast corner with a mule team and more patience than most people carry today. My father was born close enough to hear the creak from his crib. Ruthie plays there now, safe behind steel that can't be talked out of doing its one simple, honest job anymore. Deborah, wherever she is now, took something from this neighborhood that will take longer than one season to fully repair. Not just money, though that mattered too, but the easy trust neighbors used to extend each other without a second thought. Before confidence and clipboards taught everyone to ask better questions first. I don't know if she ever truly reckons with what she did, or if she simply moved on to a new version of the same old grief in a different county, carrying it quietly the way people sometimes do when they'd rather relocate than actually sit still with something painful long enough to heal. That's not really my burden to carry anymore, though. My burden, these days, is simpler and far more welcome. Feeding cattle before sunrise, mending fence when weather demands it, and watching my daughter grow up on land that no clipboard, no forged document, and no midnight bolt cutters ever managed to take. Some nights, standing at the fence line with Dana after Ruthie's asleep, I think about how close this all came to going differently. If Frank had never spoken up, if Carl had stayed quiet a little longer, if Miguel hadn't happened to leave his drone recording on an ordinary overnight pass by chance. It reminds me that boundaries, the real kind, the kind that actually hold, are rarely built by one person alone standing firm in isolation. They're built by a whole quiet network of people finally deciding, each in their own time, that watching silently costs more than speaking honestly ever will. The steel bollards still stand today, unremarkable most mornings, catching the first light exactly the way any ordinary fence post would, doing nothing dramatic, asking nothing of anyone, simply marking a line that was always true, now finally impossible for anyone to quietly drive across ever again. And every so often, usually around the anniversary Deborah once mentioned so cryptically to Denny Ruiz in the dark, I walk that corner alone, just to check the posts, just to feel the ground under my boots, and just to remind myself that some things, once properly settled, are allowed to simply stay settled. That, I've come to believe, is the quiet ending most stories like this actually deserve. Not fireworks, not headlines fading into the next news cycle, just an honest fence standing exactly where it always should have stood, holding nothing back except the one thing that never should have been taken in the first place. Ruthie asked me recently, older now and starting to understand more of the story, why Deborah did all of it. I told her the truth as best I understood it myself. Some people, when they feel like they lost something once, convince themselves they're owed the right to take something from someone else. Is that ever true? Ruthie asked. The kind of direct question only a child asks without hesitation. I told her no. Not really. Not once it turns into forged papers and bolt cutters in the dark. Feeling wronged doesn't earn you the right to wrong someone else back. That part matters most. She nodded slowly, filing the answer away the way kids do, and went back to painting a second sign for the gate. This one simply reading Bennett Ranch. 1961. Bright blue letters drying in the afternoon sun beside the very corner that had cost our family 6 months of sleepless nights. Dana hung that second sign herself the following weekend, right beside Ruthie's original welcome painting, both of them a little crooked, a little imperfect, Exactly the kind of homemade signs that belong on a working ranch fence rather than some polished HOA entryway built to impress people who'd never actually worked the land. Carl still stops by occasionally, usually with his daughter now old enough to help count cattle from the truck window. And we talk sometimes about how strange it still feels that an ordinary parking lot conversation ended up unraveling something that had been quietly rotting under Prairie View's surface for years beforehand. Frank passed along his old photograph eventually, saying he thought it belonged with me now more than with him. A strange kind of inheritance considering everything it represented. I keep it in the same folder that once held every date, every photo, every voicemail from a fight I never asked for but refused to lose. Priya jokes sometimes that our case became something of a quiet legend among local attorneys. A reminder that fabricated documents and midnight equipment eventually leave. A trail no amount of confidence can outrun forever. No matter how many meetings someone dominates or how many neighbors initially believe the wrong version of events. I don't think about Deborah often anymore. Though I won't pretend the whole ordeal didn't change something permanent in how I approach neighbors, paperwork, and quiet strangers driving too confidently across land that was never theirs to cross. Trust, once tested that hard, comes back different, more careful, but still fundamentally intact. What I think about instead, most days, is the simple fact that the fight was worth having. Not because I enjoyed any single moment of it, but because Ruthie will grow up on land that was defended honestly, documented carefully, and ultimately protected by neighbors who chose courage over comfortable silence when it counted. That, more than the steel bollards, more than the courtroom verdict, more than Deborah's quiet exit from the county, feels like the actual outcome worth keeping. Land matters. But the people willing to stand beside you when someone tries to take what's honestly yours, they matter more than any of it. So if you ever find a stranger's tires cutting new tracks across ground your family has held for generations, don't assume it's confusion. And don't assume politeness alone will settle it. Keep your folder. Keep your photographs. And find the Franks, the Carls, and the Miguels willing to stand with you. Because somewhere between the first cut wire gate and the final steel bollard, I learned that a boundary isn't really about keeping people out. It's about proving, clearly and permanently, exactly where honesty ends and someone else's story begins, and refusing, no matter the pressure, to let those two things blur together. The northeast corner of Bennett Ranch still catches the first real light every morning. Cattle grazing quietly along a fence line that finally, fully, belongs to nobody's argument but its own long, undisputed history. And somewhere past that fence, Prairie View Estates keeps its own record now too. Quarterly, public, and honest. I still see Alvin occasionally at the feed store, and he always mentions, half joking, that the community app hasn't had a single dramatic post in over a year. Ever since transparency became the new normal instead of confidence dressed up as authority. I tell him that's usually how healthy neighborhoods are supposed to sound. Dana says the whole ordeal taught Ruthie something most kids don't learn until much later in life. That fairness isn't automatic. That it has to be built, documented, and defended sometimes. But that it's always worth defending properly rather than folding early just because the fight feels exhausting in the moment. I think that's the truest thing anyone said about this whole mess. Honestly, more than any courtroom verdict or news headline ever managed to capture. Some fights choose you long before you're ready for them. What matters is whether you keep good records, keep good neighbors, and keep standing exactly where you belong. The steel bollards catch morning frost sometimes in deep winter. Unremarkable, unbothered. Exactly the way honest boundaries are supposed to look once the dust of a long fight finally settles completely into the ground it was always meant to protect in the first place. Nothing more dramatic required from that point forward. And every spring, when the grass finally grows back thick and undisturbed across that whole northeast corner, green covering the last faint traces of old tire tracks and staked survey lines nobody remembers clearly anymore, I take that as the quietest, most satisfying kind of victory a person could reasonably ask for. Land doesn't forget who tends it honestly, season after season, decade after decade, long after the people who tried to take it have moved on to some other county, some other grudge, some other clipboard meeting where nobody yet knows to ask the one simple question that finally unraveled everything here. Show me the recorded easement, with a case number, filed at the county. That question, more than any bolt cutter or backhoe or fabricated invoice, was the single thread that finally pulled the whole scheme apart, proving once again that the truth, however slow it moves, eventually outlasts even the most confident lie. Deborah Ashcroft never drove across Bennett Ranch again after that night in the dark. Restraining order or not, though honestly, she wouldn't have gotten far even if she'd tried. 12 steel posts, set deep in concrete, stand exactly where a wire gate once stood, and they have never once needed replacing since. Some neighbors still call it the Bollard Ranch around town. Half joking, half admiring, a small piece of local legend attached now to land that had quietly grown cattle for over 60 years before anyone thought its fence line was interesting enough to earn a nickname at all. Dramatic or otherwise, I don't mind the nickname much anymore. It reminds people, every time they say it, that boundaries defended honestly tend to outlast whoever tries to argue them away with confidence alone. Bennett Ranch stands where it always stood, and it always will, exactly as far as the fence line honestly says, and no farther. HOA presidents come and go in Prairie View now with far less drama than before, mostly because Alvin's transparency reforms took root deeply enough that nobody since has managed, or even really tried, to quietly steer HOA dues toward a spouse's company under the cover of Access Improvement Consulting ever again. Carl's daughter, old enough now to ask her own questions, once asked her father why he decided to speak up that night at the emergency meeting instead of staying quiet like everyone else around him. He told her the truth, that staying quiet had started to feel heavier than the fear of speaking. That answer, more than anything else that happened across those long 6 months, feels like the real lesson worth keeping close. Silence protects the person doing wrong, not the people watching it happen. Somewhere along Bennett Ranch's northeast fence line, that lesson got proven true, one honest witness at a time. Frank still walks the property line with me some evenings, coffee in hand, saying less than he used to about old grudges and old photographs. More at peace now that the whole story finally reached an ending instead of just quietly festering the way it had for decades before I ever noticed. Miguel flies his drone over Bennett Ranch occasionally still, purely for fun now instead of evidence, capturing quiet aerial footage of cattle grazing undisturbed near 12 steel posts standing calm against the horizon. A peaceful image that would have seemed impossible to imagine back during those tense, uncertain early months of conflict. Ruthie's 2 crooked hand-painted signs still hang on that gate today, weathered a little more each season, marking a boundary that took a forged easement, a staged backhoe, midnight bolt cutters, and one very determined family's folder of receipts to finally, permanently, and quietly secure once and for all. In the end, the fake HOA never got its road. Deborah never got her old family's corner back. And Richard's development deal collapsed entirely under the weight of its own dishonest paperwork. What remained, standing steady through every season since, was simply the fence, the family, and the steel that finally held the line.